Hi guys, it is Mo in the deep end, and we are starting a brand new case. I guess we just got the jitters. We were having the shakes. There were no cases that were being covered by David, so we had to make him. We had to force him into another case. So this is the case of Brandon Castiglione. I'm just going to call him Brandon from now on because seriously, names and me, not a good thing. This trial is apparently another cluster F from New Hampshire this time. Brandon is accused of killing his pastor, Luis Garcia. This is a second-degree murder case because it was not premeditated. It was more heat of the moment from what the state is presenting. He is charged with shooting the pastor in the back of the neck. Side note, apparently the pastor's stepson, about a week later, went to Brandon's father's wedding and shot the hell out of it. Three other people, I guess, got injured or killed. I am not quite sure yet. Um, and he assaulted his lawyer, then represented himself for the lawyer assault. Again, this is all from chat, but it sounds like a cluster, and I'm here for it. Uh, we may have a person from the chat or Discord or any number of the other internet-y things that can be in the court and give us kind of how the jury's taking things and different observations that they have. The judge is Judge Rolfe. And at the beginning, the judge reminds the jury, so kind of, the normal jury instruction-y things, that they're not to do any independent research. They are only to take the facts in evidence that they are given in this case by the lawyers. Um, and the jury instructions are about how the law applies it to this case and how they are not allowed to nullify, wink, wink, Brooks. Like they're going to waste a nullification on Brooks. That boy needs Jesus. There were also aspersions on IKEA, and Nick vehemently disagreed. IKEA is good, and if I could understand instructions, they would be even better. But Mr. Mo has to do all the things because no. On that sort of IQ, the spatial awareness, the mechanical stuff, dead last. So we're going into the opening statements and my general impressions of Brandon. He's dressed fairly nicely in a white button-down shirt, no tie. Um, it might just be me, but he looks very nervous and scared. His shoulders are somewhat rolled forward. Possibly my only objection is that he only has the chin part of the goatee and like scruffiness. And if you're gonna commit to the beard, just let it go. Let it grow, let it grow. But this little thing right here, I'm not sure about. It's a Mo thing. Now, the opening statement, the state's attorney looks like the nervous, anxious friend of Ferris Bueller, all grown up, with glasses. And he also looks like he might be able to help my oldest daughter with her calculus, but he is a lawyer, and lawyers are not known for their mathing, so this may be a totally wrong impression from me. He starts off they contend that the defendant shot the pastor in the back of the head. His opening line was one bullet, one casing, one gun, and these were all found outside of Brandon's room. Now, he reminds the jury that they don't have to give a motive. They just have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he did this crime. The state says the victim was at Brandon's father's house. His name is Mark, with the last name I'm not even gonna. So, Brandon, son. Mark, dad. Brandon living in Mark's house. The bullet casing and ammunition were the same as the ones that were in his little plastic, like, the little plastic three-drawer pull-out things that are usually used as like nightstands or crap accumulators at my house, it is what it is. But he kept his Glock in his room, and when the police entered, they saw the Glock in the hallway on top of the plastic drawer thing, and then they found shell casing in the room with Brandon and dead pastor. Brandon met the pastor at the New England Pentecostal church and their families met. They'd known each other for about a year and a half. The crime happened in Mark, the father's house. Brandon and his father were the only people living in the house at the time of the crime. The pastor, Luis Garcia, had been working around the house, going room to room, kind of doing remodel work. It sounds like Mark, the dad, you know, was kind of getting into that empty nest phase and wanted to make kid bedrooms into offices or use that space for something else. The day of the shooting, the pastor was working on the last bedroom on the left side of the hallway. He was in the room that Mark the father had turned into an office. All of the furniture was moved to the center of the room, and the floor and I believe the furniture was covered in a tarp. And this is kind of key to the prosecution's case. They are claiming that, Luis was shot in the back of the head. He was trapped. He couldn't escape. I mean, he was kind of cornered in this room if you are listening to their version of events. In 2 to 3 weeks before the crime, Mark would leave the house about 7:30. He would drive to Massachusetts where he was working, and he would stay there into the late afternoon, early evening time. Luis would leave his house about 8:30 and get to Mark's house about 8:45, 9ish, um, and work on whatever project he had lined up for that day. Brandon and Luis were the only two people in the house, according to the state. They keep saying kind of the same thing. Mark would call Luis on the first break of his day at 9:30 to check on the general progress of the day. And Luis was, very good about picking up the phone and giving him kind of a general rundown of what was going on. Now, this was all fairly normal and routine until October the 1st of 2019, when Luis would not answer his calls. Mark tried to call back at 11:42 a.m. and 12:14 a.m. and did not get any answer. Now, Mark at this time also called his son Brandon, and he was not answering. So Mark reached out to his daughter Danielle, and she called their grandmother Frances, who the attorney called like Frank or something, or Franny. So completely confused, and I had to listen to it twice. Um, and her husband. So Danielle, and then Granny Francis or Franny, and Granny is married to Jeff. They all knew the pastor. In fact, Luis and Patty, the pastor's wife, had lived with Franny and Jeff when they moved to New Hampshire. So Francis, the granny, tried to call Luis, and then she tried to call his wife. No one could reach Luis. So sister and grandma decided to go to the house where Luis was supposed to be the entire day. His car was in the driveway, but the house was locked up. They tried yelling, they tried throwing acorns, pebbles at the house. They could see that a light was on the far left-hand room through the window, and that was Danielle's old bedroom. Now, despite all of their efforts, they could not get a response from within the house, so they called the father back, and he told them about a key he had left hidden, so Luis could get in the house if Brandon was still asleep. And a side note, since I think all of my kids are born, I have never been able to sleep in past 7:30. This man would not be awake, Brandon, I mean. Look, this is the only thing I'm going to throw shade at right now because I'm assuming he's innocent. But dude, it is 9 a.m. Unless you are working like late night shifts, I need you to be awake and helping the pastor do stuff. Or just be awake because I can't sleep in. I mean, really, it's just not fair. I haven't slept in past 6 since I've had kidlets. And I'm just saying, ugh. Okay. Little mini rant over. Danielle found the key in the hiding spot and went up the stairs to her old room. Then she was shocked with finding her brother Brandon somewhat in the doorway in a fetal position or on his hands and knees. It's described both ways, mumbling and not really anything that she could understand, and that will be important later. Um, she also saw Luis on his back with blood pooling around his head. So she runs out. Uh, she claims that she ran back and told Granny, and Grandmother went into the room and saw the same thing. Now, the ladies called 911, and I believe the town is called Londonderry or Londonderry. I will look into it. But they were dispatched and they saw several crucial things when they entered the house. The pistol was on top of the set of drawers, so kind of like this guy, but the white plastic things you see in all college dorms. And the Glock was right here. The defendant was kind of a couple feet in the room on in that fetal weird position, and then behind the furniture laying on his back to where they could only see his legs was Luis Garcia. There was also a bullet casing and bullet something between the defendant and the decedent. Again, the prosecutor says the line, one bullet, one casing, one murderer, and points to Brandon at this time in the room with Luis. The bullet and the casing were sent to the New Hampshire State Crime Lab, and they are linked to Brandon's gun. Now, the crimes tech will state that the bullet and the casing are linked to Brandon's gun. The casing and bullet were copper casing hollow point bullets marketed by a company I think is called Fasci. I don't know. The pistol was also looked at for fingerprints by another crime tech, and she will testify that the only fingerprints that she found were Brandon's. When the state investigators got on the scene, the windows were shut, the doors were locked, except the door that the sister and grandmother had opened. And it looked like there were items in front of windows to obscure view. The state investigators found no evidence of anyone else in the house that morning besides Brandon, Luis, and the sister grandmother duo. The medical examiner is going to explain that Luis Garcia was shot from behind and that the bullet entered the right base of his skull and exited the left front of his neck. I am dead awful at directions too, so just imaginate that your own self. The medical examiner will also explain that the gunshot was not self-inflicted. He had no evidence about the Clintons. I mean, allegedly. And that it was at a fairly close range. I don't know if they're going to bring stippling or any of that stuff into the thing, or into the case. The damage the shot did basically severed Lewis's spinal cord, causing him to collapse and bleed out. The gun and bullet casing were all there, and regardless of the reason the defendant shot Mr. Garcia, he did it, and the law is clear that the crime is second-degree murder, and the cause of death for Luis was a shot in the back of the neck, and they allege that Brandon did it. The defendant did not call 911 or answer his cell phone when he was found in the room with Luis. Again, the main crux of their argument is that quite logically, I mean, you see a guy in a room, there's a gun near him, there's shell casing in between him and the decedent. As anti-government as I am right now, as, state as bad as I am, I can see why they would jump to conclusions that, this man could possibly be involved. Again, at the end, the state says that they don't have to provide a motive for why this happened. They just have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that it did. Then it's the defense's turn, and the defense is an older balding man that Dave now said looked like the guy who made the jump to conclusion mats in Office Space, and now I cannot unsee it, and I need to go see the Bobs. I just do. Now, this defense attorney moves the lectern, and I think he's one of those like walk and talkers. He's not one to stay behind the lectern. I think he wanted to get more personal. I kind of like that for the defense attorney. I actually just liked a defense doing something besides walking out and saying this is a terrible case. So it's a breath of fresh air from the Letitia Stalk, Will, Eeyore, and Mountain Dew kind of, semi-defense that we got for her. He says the state is all about jumping to conclusions, and I'm going to try to avoid that now because if I don't, I will just go watch Office Space and not finish any of my notes. The police found Brandon praying in the room with Luis and jumped to the conclusion that he was the one that did the shooting. Brandon was immediately cuffed and placed in the back of a police car once police got on the scene. Since the police assumed that Brandon was the guilty party, there were things that they didn't do to pursue other avenues of investigation. The police only looked for evidence that pointed to Brandon, and dear Lord, stop saying jumping to conclusions. I'm going to have to tell the Bobs that I'm not a people person, I'm an engineer, so we definitely need this guy because we are bad at peopling. I mean, look at the shirt. It was cold outside, there were people, 0 stars, do not recommend. Just saying. And basically, the whole argument from the defense is that the state had blinders on. They found a man that was, in the room and they just went with it. As the judge told you, Brandon sits in the courtroom, an innocent man. The government has to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest test of kind of guilt that we have in the country. And he goes on to explain what will give you reasonable doubt in this case. And he states quite clearly, you are going to have doubt in the government's case. Now, I'd like to note here that New Hampshire is kind of the birthplace, kind of the nascent nexus of the Free State kind of libertarian movement. So this could be an actual tactical thing to continue to reiterate that the state is the government to a jury that might have very Dale Gribble leanings, very anti-government, very anti-Big Brother, rushing in to crush the little guy leanings. I did not watch voir dire, so I don't know if that was a strategy, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. The police just, had blinders on when the first officer arrived. He found Brandon kneeling and praying, and within 5 minutes, he was cuffed and in the back of a squad car. He was in the squad car long before the major crimes or the, detectives or investigators were there, but they were aware that there was a suspect already in custody. And the defense is claiming that that really colored their investigation from that point on. The fact that they know this affects everything they did going forward. Because the police had this base fact, they kind of stopped looking at anything that would exonerate Brandon. They believed this was a fairly open and shut case. And again, to be honest, despite my Big Brother government Dale Gribbleness, I mean, I don't fault the police for going into a room, seeing a dead body, seeing a man, beside them, gun very near, bullets and casings on the floor, and jumping to that conclusion. Now, what I do fault the government in, if everything else that the defense attorney says is happened, is not properly testing, not looking for other things just to make sure that their case is airtight. I don't understand that, but I also don't know budgetary things. So government's still bad, but kind of understand why, guy in the room with a dead guy and gun nearby might be like, oh, easy case. There was evidence, the defense attorney claims, that was not tested. Uh, the police knew they were looking at a homicide by gun. When you fire a weapon, is a ton of um, gunshot residue, the gas, the black powder that goes onto your hands, your body, your clothing, and the state got a body warrant for all of these things, swabs of the hand, his clothing. However, they never tested those things. Now, I do not know at this point if the defense did in fact test these things. Kind I am not a lawyer. I don't know what kind of things you do, and I am not Daryl Brooks enough to pretend that I will know those things. He asks the jury to pay attention to all the times in this case that the police collected evidence, however, did not test it or did not do anything else with it. He's asking the jury to think about those undone tests when the jury is weighing the evidence the state brings against Brandon. One of the more crucial things he claims that the government did not prove or did not do is that they collected Brandon's cell phone, but did nothing with it, didn't do the star bright or any of the sort of things that might, track his GPS down to a few feet or see if someone else texted to say they were coming over to the house instead of just being Luis and Brandon. They simply did not test that. That's that's not the only piece that he claims that the government either did not collect or did not test. He really hammers home that the police, had their blinders on, didn't look at anyone else, and once they got Brandon, dead to rights in their mind, they really did not look at anything else. It was brought up in the chat that the state possibly lost the gun in this case. So they only really have the similar box of ammo that was in Brandon's room. I am, again, not quite sure this was a chat thing. Our chat tends to be very, very good at knowing the facts, but it can happen that we're, a little bit off sometimes. Uh, they did not go in with an unbiased mind. The attorney brings up the gun the government mentioned in their opening statement and claims that, yes, they did find Brandon's fingerprints on Brandon's gun. This isn't shocking. What the government or the state didn't tell you is that prior to the lab getting the gun, they were told to only look for evidence that would implicate Brandon. You're going to hear that prior to the fingerprint testing on the gun, they took 6 swabs to test for touch DNA. Now, touch DNA are minute skin flakes and other things that we leave on everyday items. DNA testing has gotten so good that they can take these very minute samples and get results. He also says that, it is very hard to get fingerprints from a gun. I am assuming that his Glock grip was textured, so the lab would want to use touch DNA in case they were unable to get fingerprints off of the pistol. These swabs were from the handle and the trigger and not where they found the fingerprints. The lab was told by the state to find evidence that linked to Brandon. If they found that, do not go any further. So they found the fingerprints and then did not test for the gunshot residue or the touch DNA or anything like that. Apparently, this sort of edict came from the lead investigator in this case. Now, you heard when Brandon's sister and grandma arrived, and even the police, he was on his hands and feet, or on his hands and knees, and in the fetal position, and he was speaking in tongues. Now, this is not uncommon for Brandon. He is part of the Pentecostal denomination of Christianity, and without going too deep into it, they are fully into the Feast of Pentecost, where, the Holy Spirit came down, and one of the signs of great faith is that you can talk in tongues or speak a different language. And that's about all I know about that. So that's about as far as I'm going to go. But in his particular denomination, this is not abnormal when you are deep in prayer or touched by the Holy Spirit or what have you. I have only been to a Pentecostal church once. It scared the Jesus out of me. I'm a recovering Catholic. We have like up, down, sit, stand, kneel. We know the deal. This running up and down the hallway, falling down. I was a little kid. It was a culture shock, and I have never gone back. So that's my entire knowledge of that. Um, the defense brings up that this is a very strong religious tradition in the Church of Pentecost. I mean, this is not something abnormal. If you are a practicing Pentecostal person, you just, this is just a part of everyday worship. And witnesses are going to state that when Brandon is deep in prayer, I mean, it is not uncommon for him to get in a state where he is unaware, cannot be reached by, people touching him, trying to move him, and he does speak in tongues. Now, the state cannot prove that he wasn't, having one of these deep, prayerful moments after finding the body of his pastor. The attorney states it's not illogical, it's not a stretch of the imagination to believe that if Brandon came upon the body of his pastor, that he would go into a state of shock and deep prayer at reaction to this kind of horrible sight. The government doesn't have to prove motive, the attorney says, because it has no reason that Brandon would shoot Luis. You're going to hear from many witnesses that they did, church functions with each other, small groups. A small group is where parishioners get together, and there's usually, 4 or 5 people, and you kind of deep dive into a certain subject in the Bible, or it could be a book that, kind of leads you on a devotional thing. So they did Bible small groups together. They socialized outside of church. Now, side note, I don't know what Pentecostals do for fun, but if this is the result, okay, I'm going straight to, look, Lord Jesus, I'm very sorry. We're a little irreverent here. If you're Pentecostal, I'm sorry. I don't know, but maybe vodka would help. It helps in all situations. Also, side note, do not listen to me for life advice. If you are coming to me as the voice of reason, stop, yield, halt, go backwards, find someone else. This is a terrible idea if you are coming to me for solid human advice. But we are going to hear about, them having a friendly relationship. There was no animosity toward, Brandon to Luis, Luis to Brandon, that anyone can attest to. And when you hear all the evidence that the government gives, they cannot prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt because the police only looked at evidence that would convict Brandon and did not allow the evidence to lead them, but rather investigated evidence that would prove their point. The simple reason that the state can't prove its case is that Brandon is innocent and he did not shoot Luis. He is innocent of this crime. So those are the opening statements, kind of pared down, and hopefully I made sense of who's Francis, who's Luis, where is Jeff in all of this. Because I can tell you, listening last night, it was a bit fuzzy as to where everyone is and who did what and who's on first. So hopefully I kind of made it a little more clear. And, we have our cast of characters now. We have Brandon, the defendant. We have defense attorney jump to conclusion Matt guy, and state's attorney Ferris Bueller's nervous best friend with glasses. So we've got a whole cast of characters. I am breaking down the first witness right after this and should be able to give you a fuller idea of day one, at least from what was streamed. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everyone uh, that I am here trying to break things down, make sense of these things, and I will see you all soon. Have a great day. Try to be a little bit less of a dick if you can. If you can't, I understand. We all have those days. Some days we all feel like we wanted to build a killdozer. That man was a hero. I'm just saying. I'll see y'all later. Stay safe on the internet. Bye.